The radio broke at 0347, not with static, not with the routine hiss and click of a position check. It broke with a voice that had already spent everything it had trying to hold the situation together and had nothing left to hold it with. Bravo Company is pinned. Valley is a kill box. 480 Marines, ammunition critical. We cannot push. We cannot pull back. We need. The voice stopped, not because the transmission ended, because the man speaking had run out of words for what he was looking at. In the operations center at FOB Edinburgh, 12 people stopped breathing at the same time. The duty officer set down his coffee. A corporal at the drone terminal leaned forward until his forehead nearly touched the screen. The overhead lights hummed the way they always hummed, indifferent and mechanical, knowing nothing about the men dying 40 kilometers south. Then a second voice came through the net, calm, low, steady as a metronome in an empty room. Ghost 209 has overwatch, corridor is open. The room went still in a different way. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of people trying to locate something they could not find on any map or roster or document in the building. The duty officer grabbed the handset. Ghost 209 identify. Who is this? What is your position? No answer. Ghost 209, this is Edinburgh Actual. Identify yourself immediately. The net clicked once, then nothing. Nobody in that room could pull a name to match the call sign. Nobody could explain why a single rifle fired from an uncleared position by someone who had not been authorized to be there was doing what an entire command structure had failed to do in the previous 90 minutes. They would know by morning. But that is where this story ends, not where it begins. 6 weeks earlier, FOB Edinburgh was the kind of place that made you understand why men counted days on the inside of their wrist with a pen. The base sat in a flat expanse of Helmand province like something the desert had swallowed halfway and decided wasn't worth finishing. Concrete barriers in irregular rows, sand that found its way into food, into weapons, into the crease of every eyelid. The smell of diesel and dust and something older underneath, something the land had been exhaling for 1,000 years before any Marine ever set boot on it. April in Helmand meant the cold hadn't quite let go yet. Mornings bit at exposed skin. Afternoons burned white. The light came down hard and flat and made everything look slightly unreal, like a photograph taken a half-second too late. Sergeant Nora Callahan had stopped noticing most of it. She had cataloged it on arrival and filed it away, which was how she processed environments comprehensively. Once then, not again unless something changed. She was 27 years old, 5'4", 131 pounds in full kit. Her hair was the color of old wood pinned back with a precision that matched everything else about her. Her eyes were a pale, flat gray that some people found unsettling and others simply failed to register, which was closer to the truth of her than most observations. She sat on an overturned ammunition crate outside the eastern motor pool, cross-legged with her M40A5 across her lap and a small green notebook balanced on her knee. The morning was cold enough to see her breath. She had not lit the portable heater that sat 2 feet to her left. The rifle was broken down in front of her on a clean cloth. Bolt-face barrel scope rings, each component laid out in a sequence so practiced it had become automatic. She ran a bore brush through the barrel, checked the lands and grooves with a penlight, and made a notation in the notebook. Wind at 0541. Humidity up from yesterday. Dope adjustment, 1 click left, confirm at range. 2 supply clerks walked past with trays from the chow hall, talking over each other about something from the previous night. They did not look at her. She was part of the scenery. Equipment that had been positioned and not yet moved. This was the shape of Callahan's days at FOB Edinburgh. She had been assigned 8 weeks earlier on orders that described her role as support duty pending forward rotation. In practice, this meant she managed ammunition inventory for the battalion's logistics section, ran weekly maintenance checks on communications equipment, and filled whatever gap presented itself on a given day. She performed all of it without complaint and without comment. She was competent and quiet and present when required and absent when not. And most of the people at FOB Edinburgh had formed no particular impression of her beyond those qualities. What her personnel file at Edinburgh did not contain, what no one at the base had been told, was that Sergeant Nora Callahan carried a designation inside a sealed record that had been locked away 2 years earlier. 3 confirmed long-range engagements. 2 additional shots unconfirmed in official documentation, but known precisely to the men who had been present at distances the instructors at the Scout Sniper School in Quantico cited as theoretical maximums in their classroom exercises because they did not believe distances beyond them were operationally realistic. A call sign that had moved through a small community of people before the file containing it was classified and put away. Ghost 209. None of that existed on paper at FOB Edinburgh. The men who had served alongside her in those operations had been reassigned. The officers who knew had been told to maintain the classification. She had arrived at Edinburgh with a clean personnel record and a set of orders that left no interpretive room. Her role was support, not operational, not forward. Support. She understood the administrative logic of it. She had spent 8 weeks trying to determine whether understanding something and accepting it were the same condition. She had not reached a conclusion. The notebook in her hands was the third one she had filled since arriving. The previous two were in her footlocker, bound together with a rubber band, their pages dense with data. Ballistic tables, wind behavior charts for different times of day, different elevations, different temperature ranges. Sketches of terrain, features she had studied from aerial photographs, and topographic maps she had printed from the operations center's color printer during maintenance shifts. She had the access because she maintained the equipment. Nobody had told her not to use it. She turned to a page near the middle of the current notebook. A sketch she had drawn 5 weeks ago, in her first week after arriving at Edinburgh before the convoy schedule existed, before the operation had a name or a route marked on any official map. She had drawn it because the terrain made it necessary, because the contour lines on the topographic printout told a story with only one ending if you knew how to read it. She had drawn it the way her father taught her to read ground, not as a map, but as a consequence. Every fold of terrain was a decision made by gravity and erosion over thousands of years, and those decisions did not change because a command briefing assessed them as manageable. The sketch showed a valley running southeast to northwest, roughly 4 kilometers long, flanked on both sides by ridgelines that curved inward at the southern end like a pair of arms beginning to close. She had labeled the high points with their approximate elevations. She had marked 3 positions in red ink, small circles with the letter M beside each one. Machine gun positions, 2 more circles marked ORPG. Below the sketch, in her small, precise handwriting, one line: "If they go in here, they cannot get out." She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote the morning's maintenance notes. Gunnery Sergeant Walt Breslin found her at 0645. He was 44 years old, broad-framed, with a face that years of operational service had weathered into a kind of permanent, useful neutrality. He sat down on a second ammunition crate without invitation and looked at the rifle components on the cloth without speaking. He was a man who understood that silence could be either empty or full, and who had learned the difference through enough experience to use it deliberately. "There's a briefing at 1400, he said after a while. "I heard. General sweep of the southern corridor, battalion level." She wrote something in her notebook. "Callahan." "I'm listening, Gunny." He looked at the sketch visible at the edge of the page she was writing on. She made no move to cover it. He studied it for a moment with the expression of a man who has just been handed a piece of information he will need to remember. "That's not the Panjwai corridor," he said. "No." He stood, brushed dust from his trousers. 1400, he said, and walked back toward the operations building. She watched him go. Then she looked at the sketch. Then she picked up her bore brush and continued working. Colonel Drummond ran the 1400 briefing the way he ran everything, standing both hands clasped behind his back, eyes moving across the room in a systematic pattern that suggested cataloging rather than observation. He was 51 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and a face set into controlled authority so long it had become structural. His voice projected, without raising in pitch, the learned instrument of a man who had given orders in loud places. He stood before a projected map of the southern corridor. A red line traced a route down into a valley that Callahan, in the back row with her notebook open on her thigh, recognized from her sketch before Drummond had finished his second sentence. She had been looking at that valley for 5 weeks. Drummond briefed efficiently. The operation was a battalion-level sweep of a valley assessed as lightly defended. Enemy activity had shifted north according to the previous week's intelligence. The route was manageable. 2 mechanized columns clearing south and withdrawing by last light. Clean, contained. The word he used twice was straightforward. He paused for questions. Callahan raised her hand. The room held roughly 30 people. Officers and senior NCOs mostly. She was the most junior person present. Several of the officers near her did not turn to look. "Sergeant," Drummond said, evenly, calibrated to convey nothing. "Sir, the valley's southern approach narrows to approximately 80 meters at the 2-kilometer mark." She kept her voice factual, unhurried. "The ridgelines on both flanks have 3 natural defilade positions each. The geometry creates interlocking fields of fire across the entire valley floor. If a prepared force wanted to construct a kill box, This terrain is the template for it. The intelligence assessment may be accurate, but the terrain doesn't consult intelligence assessments before it's used. A major in the second row turned to examine her with an expression that resisted categorization. Drummond held her gaze for a moment. What is your assignment here, Sergeant? Logistics, support, and communications maintenance, sir. Then that is the work that requires your attention. Not my operational planning. He looked back at the map. Anyone else? Not a question. He moved on. Callahan wrote 2 words in the notebook. She did not raise her hand again. The briefing ended at 15:20. Men gathered gear and moved toward the door in the efficient clusters of people with things to do. No one spoke to Callahan. She waited for the room to clear before standing, then moved toward the exit. She was 3 steps from the door when Drummond said her name. Not her rank. Not sergeant. Her last name, the way you say a name when the rank no longer covers what you mean. She turned. He was standing beside the projected map alone. The image behind him showed the valley and the flat light of a topographic rendering, every elevation line precise and indifferent. Your file says Sangan, 2008, he said. Yes, sir. And before that? Yes, sir. He looked at her the way a man looks at a decision he has already made and is reviewing for the final time. I know what you can do, he said. That is not what this conversation is about. She waited. I had a corporal at Fallujah, 2004. His voice had not changed in any measurable way. Outstanding radio operator. Best in the company. I made a judgment and moved her up to a forward position to cut 20 minutes off a clearance timeline. He paused. She was dead inside the hour. I wrote her family personally. I have not made that kind of calculation since. Callahan said nothing for a moment. Outside vehicles were starting up. An engine turning over, coffins hatching. I understand, sir, she said. Good, then we're clear. She walked out into the late afternoon, stood for a moment with the notebook in her hand, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the weight of the words she had not said, and the ones she had said, and the space between them where the valley sat unchanged, waiting. That night, she opened the notebook to the valley sketch and added 3 new annotations she had been holding in her head since the briefing. Enemy placement based on ridge geometry. Estimated fields of fire for a prepared machine gun position on the east spur. The time calculation from first contact to critical ammunition expenditure for a mechanized column of the size Drummond was committing. She worked for an hour. Then she closed the notebook, placed it in her footlocker on top of the first 2, and lay down with her forearm across her eyes. Her father had been dead for 19 years. The specific details of him had eroded with time. His voice was gone, his face known only from photographs. The weight of his hand on her shoulder. Something she sometimes thought she remembered, and other times believed she had reconstructed from need. What remained was more structural, the angle of certain light, the smell of dry grass at the end of summer, and the lesson given so many times in the years before Desert Storm took him from a single vehicle engagement in a desert she couldn't find on a map, until she was 12, that it had long since stopped being memory and become architecture. You don't move until you know, but when you know, you don't wait. She had been 8 years old when the casualty notification officer came to the door. Her mother had made coffee before she understood why he was there. Callahan had watched from the top of the stairs, feet bare on cold wood, understanding in the complete wordless way that children understand things that cannot be taken back. She had enlisted the week she turned 18. Not to continue anything, not to honor anyone. She had enlisted because she was already made of the same material, and the question was only where to put it. She earned her sniper billet through a selection process that eliminated the majority of the men who attempted it. She completed it without ceremony. When she graduated, she had the Marine sniper emblem tattooed on the inside of her left forearm, the scoped rifle framed by Laurel. Not where anyone would see it, where she would. 3 deployments, 3 notebooks of accumulated fieldcraft, and now a 4th in her footlocker at Edinburgh containing a sketch no one had asked her to make of a valley that was going to consume 480 men who did not know what she knew. She did not sleep well. The convoy rolled at 0600. 3 columns mechanized the sound of it, filling the base for 20 minutes before it faded south and was replaced by ordinary noise. Callahan stood at the motor pool's edge and watched the last vehicles disappear over the rise. The dust they left behind drifted east in the morning wind. She stood there longer than was necessary. Then she walked to the communications center, sat at the primary terminal, and began the morning work. Signal strength at each relay. Diagnostic on the secondary antenna array. The maintenance forms filled in her small, precise handwriting. She did all of it. She was good at all of it. She did not have to think about any of it, which meant that another part of her mind was doing something else entirely, tracking the radio traffic from the convoy, the way she tracked wind, not looking directly at it, but aware of it, completely building a picture from pattern and deviation and the space between what was transmitted and what was meant. The traffic was routine for the first 3 hours. Position checks, fuel status, a vehicle running warm, a squad leader requesting grid clarification, the normal friction of men and machinery in motion. At 10:43, the pattern changed. One report came in late, then another. Two voices overlapped on the net, which meant two things were happening simultaneously that both required radio. A call for dismounts that ended mid-sentence. Then a squad leader's voice arrived, with a texture Callahan had heard before in other places, and hoped not to hear again the voice of a man watching the world he understood. Stop being that world. Contact. Contact east. The net fractured, taking fire multiple positions. East ridge. West spur. Draw is hot. Column is pinned. We are, she set down her pen, placed both hands flat on the desk. Looked at the radio console the way you look at something you have been expecting and do not want to see. Through the wall, she could hear the operations room coming alive. Voices sharpening. Chairs. The duty officer's phone picked up and set down and picked up again. She opened her notebook to the valley sketch. Looked at the 3 red circles marked M. The 2 circles marked RPG. The annotation at the bottom written 5 weeks ago in her own hand. If they go in here, they cannot get out. She closed the notebook, put it in her cargo pocket, stood up, removed her headset and hung it on its hook with the precision of someone who has decided what they are going to do and is completing the previous task correctly before beginning the next. She walked to the door and opened it into the afternoon. Somewhere south 40 kilometers into a valley she had mapped from a printout before the operation had a name, 480 Marines were learning she was right. She went to her bunk. She opened her footlocker. She lifted out the M40A5 in its case, the spare magazines in their pouches, the rangefinder and the notebook in its plastic sleeve. She tucked the sleeve against her chest beside her father's dog tag worn since she was 18, its letters softened by years of contact with her skin. She looked at what she was carrying, exactly what was required. Through the barracks window, she could hear the operations center voices colliding in the specific way they collide when command structure encounters a situation it hasn't built a procedure for. A number being cited, a rule being invoked, the rule repeated as though volume could convert it into action. She thought about what her father had written in the margin of one of his own field notebooks, which she had found in a cardboard box when she was 12 and had memorized before she understood what it meant. The protocol serves the mission. When it doesn't, you serve the mission. She slung the rifle, felt the weight of it settle across her chest. Exact, familiar, like a piece of the world locating itself correctly. She walked out of the barracks, turned south, and did not look back. Breslin found her at the gate. He was moving at the pace of a man who knew where to look and had looked there first. He came alongside her without slowing, matching her stride, and for a dozen steps neither spoke. The gate guard looked at her rifle and looked at Breslin's rank and decided against speaking. Breslin said, "Machine guns on the east spur, RPG team in the draw, air is denied inside 200 meters. Drummond is holding to protocol." "I know. 480 Marines." "I know, Gunny." He walked with her through the gate and into the open ground south of the perimeter, where the terrain began its gradual rise toward the first ridgeline. He reached into his vest and produced a tablet. He held it out without stopping. She took it. A personnel file on the screen, her name at the top. Below it, 3 mission entries dated 2007 and 2008. Location grid reference distance result. 2 of the distance figures looked like transcription errors until you checked them against the grid references and understood they were not. Below the 3rd entry, a block of administrative language. Record sealed per command authority. Classification, operational necessity. A date, October 2008. A signature she could not read at this resolution. At the bottom of the file, a call sign she hadn't seen written anywhere in 14 months. Ghost 209. She handed the tablet back without breaking stride. Who else has seen this? Nobody at Edinburgh. Pulled it this morning through a back channel after the convoy rolled. He paused. The seal was authorized at command level. Someone at this FOB had the authority to sign it. He said nothing more about the name on the document. She did not ask. Some things clarified when the time for clarity arrived, and some things stayed obscured until they didn't, and she had learned not to spend resources on the interval. "Your file was sealed 2 years ago," Breslin said. "Nobody here knows who you are." "I know." He walked with her to the 200-meter mark from the wire. At that point, he stopped. She felt his footsteps cease behind her, and she kept walking, and she did not look back. The approach to the Overwatch Ridge was 2 kilometers of ground she had studied from aerial photographs until it existed in her head with the same fidelity as her own hands. She knew where the shale ran loose along the eastern face. She knew the gradient change at the 400-meter mark. She knew the 2 places on the route where movement would briefly silhouette against the sky if she didn't compensate for the angle. She compensated. She moved low where the terrain required it, stayed in the shadow line where the afternoon ridge threw shade east, picked her route through the shale fields in the careful diagonal she had planned weeks ago when she studied the approach and told herself she was doing it as an exercise. She had not been doing it as an exercise. Her left knee had a history. A training injury at Pendleton 18 months ago documented as resolved, which it mostly was. The last 200 meters of the climb reminded her of the difference between mostly and fully. She adjusted her stride, redistributed her weight, and kept her breathing controlled through the discomfort the way the school had taught her, and years of subsequent experience had made automatic. She reached the crown of the ridge and went prone before her silhouette could clear the skyline. Settled the bipod. Let the scope do its work. The valley opened below her. She had done the mathematics. She had run the geometry in her notebook. She had understood intellectually what a kill box operating at design capacity looked like in numerical terms. Looking at it through a scope was a different kind of understanding. The convoy had been stationary for roughly 90 minutes. 2 vehicles burning at the southern end of the column, the smoke rising in the still air above the valley in columns that were almost vertical, which told her the surface wind down there was minimal, and the thermal wind from the ridges was doing most of the work. Marines pressed flat behind whatever the valley floor offered, which was not much, which was the point. Muzzle flashes moving in the controlled rhythm of sustained fire from 3 positions on the eastern ridge and 2 on the western spur. Not maximum rate, sustained, designed to keep heads down and ammunition draining and options closing. She had marked every one of those positions 5 weeks ago. The anger she expected did not arrive. What arrived instead was colder and more useful, the state she had entered before in other valleys, and on other days the state in which the world contracted to the diameter of the scope, and everything inside that circle became geometry, and everything outside it temporarily ceased to require processing. She found the machine gun position on the east spur, 940 meters. The wind at ridge level was quartering from the southwest, stronger than the valley floor, gusting in the irregular thermal pattern Helmand afternoons produced. She watched the grass on the near slope for 30 seconds and built a wind picture in her head, checked her dope against the data she had memorized, made 2 adjustments to the scope. She put the reticle on the position, controlled her breathing, found the natural pause at the bottom of the exhale. She squeezed. The gun on the east spur continued to fire. She lay still for a moment. The wind had shifted in the half-second before the break, a gust that moved the muzzle fractionally at the moment of ignition. The kind of thing the school accounted for, the kind of thing she had trained to manage. She had managed it, and the shot had missed anyway. 940 meters was not a distance that forgave the variables she could not fully control, and the wind in this valley was not cooperating with the model she had built from the topographic data. She cycled the bolt without looking at it, rebuilt the wind picture from the beginning, not from where she had left it. The picture she had built was 5 seconds old, and the wind did not honor pictures. She waited, watched the grass, watched the smoke column from the burning vehicle, felt the air on her face for the brief interval between gusts when it settled. She fired. The gun on the east spur stopped. Not dramatically. The way a machine stops when the operator can no longer operate, the barrel stayed in position. The rhythm of fire that had been sustained for 90 minutes ended on a single beat. On the valley floor, Marines in the compressed space along the eastern edge felt the change before they understood it, heads lifted by increments. The air in the pocket they had occupied shifted in some quality that was not measurable but was nonetheless real. She was already moving the scope. The RPG team in the draw had repositioned, closer to the column than their last location. One man with a launcher on his shoulder, the second feeding a rocket into the tube. She measured the angle to the target, accounted for the slope differential between her position and the draw, adjusted for the likely trajectory of the tube toward the vehicle it was aimed at. Read the smoke drift from the burning vehicle at the column's southern end. She fired. The man with the launcher went down before the rocket was seated. The second man grabbed for it, looked at his partner, looked at the ridgeline above him, and ran. The rocket lay in the dirt and did not fire. She moved. 3 meters left along the prone line, staying below the ridge crown. 2 shots from the same position at 2 different targets produced a line. A line produced a direction. A direction produced a location. Someone in that valley was paid to think about exactly this sequence of reasoning. Counterfire came 40 seconds after she moved. A burst of automatic fire swept the position she had vacated, moving left to right at the pace of searching rather than certainty. She was already past the right edge of the pattern by 2 meters. She pressed flat against the rock and counted her heartbeats as a measure of time. 17, 18, 19. The counterfire moved south along the ridgeline and stopped. She raised the rifle and found her scope. She was shifting her position to the western spur when the movement opened the gash in her sleeve. The shale edge on the near side of her movement caught the fabric and raked upward past her elbow in the same motion, and when she settled back into prone and looked at her left forearm to assess the minor cut from the rock, she saw the tattoo. The Marine sniper emblem. The scoped rifle framed by Laurel on the inside of her forearm, clear in the afternoon light, uncovered without her choosing to uncover it. She had kept it under her sleeve at FOB Edinburgh for 8 weeks, not out of concealment. Exactly. More out of the understanding that some evidence is most useful when the people who need to see it are not yet ready to understand what it means. Here on the ridge, 40 kilometers from the base, and the opinions it held about her, the emblem caught the light without permission and without apology. She looked at it for one breath, then she put her eye back to the scope. The western spur had 2 active positions. She identified the command node by the pattern of communication between the positions. Movement at the near node preceded coordinated changes across the entire ambush by 2 to 3 seconds consistently. She had been watching it since she arrived on the ridge. The man at that position was not a gunner. He was the organizing structure of the ambush, the thing that kept it from being a collection of individual fires and made it instead a single coordinated system. She put the reticle on him. She held it. Something had changed in the pattern of fire from the eastern ridge. Not the volume, the elevation. The guns still active on that side had adjusted their angle upward. They were not firing into the valley floor. They were firing at the opposite ridge line to the north, the position that a shooter establishing overwatch on this valley would choose by instinct and by the logic of the terrain, the natural high ground on the north face elevated with clear lines of sight down the full length of the valley. The position she would have selected if she had approached from the north. She understood the notebook then completely, and without remainder, the way a shape you have been looking at from one angle suddenly resolves when you shift your perspective by a degree. They had not only used her sketches to place their positions, they had used them to predict her. The data she had compiled about optimal overwatch locations, the approach routes she had assessed, and annotated the logic of her own tactical thinking written down in her precise handwriting in a green notebook left on a desk in a forward operating base with no lock on it. Someone had photographed those pages. The local interpreter who had processed his travel documents and left the FOB 48 hours before the convoy departed, she had not known his name, had barely noticed his presence. Had noticed his absence? Not at all. They had built this ambush to destroy the convoy and to kill the sniper who would respond to it. They had prepared a position to engage that sniper at the north face approach. They had built it for Ghost 209. They had not known Ghost 209 would read the terrain differently and come from the south. She fired at the command node on the western spur. Then she moved fast, scraping her forearm against a rock as she went, the burn of it cataloged and set aside. She went left 10 meters along the crown, settled back into prone, found the scope. She worked, not at the pace of inspiration. At the pace of someone who has done this enough times that the individual steps no longer require deliberation, only execution. Target, wind, hold, fire, cycle, move. The sequence assembled itself without the gap of decision between components. A gun on the western spur. She cycled and moved. The eastern ridge, again a gunner, who had been searching for her location for 90 seconds and had narrowed his search to a zone that was no longer safe to occupy. She was cycling the bolt when the fragment hit. The bullet struck rock 8 inches from her right shoulder. The rock did not simply fracture, it detonated in the small, sharp way that rock detonates under high-velocity impact, and a piece of it, the size of a thumbnail, caught her right forearm below the sleeve and opened a line across the muscle. Not deep, deep enough. She looked at it for the time it took to complete one breath. Then she pulled a folded bandage from her vest with her left hand, pressed it against the cut, and held it in place by pulling her sleeve down over it. She checked her right hand. Functional. The cut was across the outer muscle, not into the structure beneath. Pain was specific and locatable, which meant it was manageable information rather than a disabling condition. She put her eye back to the scope. The valley below had changed. Not in the way she had imagined when she prepared for this in the abstract space of planning, but in the more complicated way that real things change imperfectly, incompletely in the uneven rhythm of a situation. losing its organization one piece at a time. The ambush was not broken. It was coming apart. The positions she had removed were not being replaced. The coordinated fields of fire were developing gaps. The gaps were narrow, but they were real and they were growing. On the net in her ear, the quality of the transmissions had shifted. The fragmented, urgent voices of men in crisis were acquiring a different texture. Not calm, not confident, something more tentative and more precious than either the sound of men beginning to believe something might be possible. A squad leader cut through the net with controlled precision, the voice of a man who had decided to be controlled because the alternative was worse. Something's working on the east spur. Machine gun is down. Command, do we have air? The reply from Edinburgh came back negative. No CAS cleared. Then who the hell is shooting? She fired twice in the next 40 seconds, and the answer to his question became slightly less important than the fact of it. She ran the ammunition count without looking away from the scope. 17 rounds in the first magazine, all expended. The second magazine, the same, emptied across the valley's architecture over the course of the engagement. Third magazine loaded 6 minutes ago, 4 rounds fired from it. 32 rounds total, 6 remaining. She noted this as data without valuation and continued working. The corridor was opening. She could see it in the pattern of remaining fire. The spaces where positions had been that were now silent, the reduced volume across the valley floor, the compressed space of the ambush, developing exits where there had been none. Not open yet. Still active positions on both flanks, still putting rounds into the valley with purpose. But the geometry had changed. A killbox requires its walls. She had been removing the walls. She worked the remaining positions in the sequence she had prioritized before she took the first shot, a sequence she had thought through when she first drew the valley 5 weeks ago, and told herself she was doing it as an exercise. She had not been doing it as an exercise. Her forearm was bleeding steadily through the bandage. She noted this as well and continued. The first helicopter came over the southern ridgeline at 14:23. She heard it before she saw it. Then a second. The radio net shifted, and the voice she had been hearing for the past hour, Trident Actual Walsh, the task force commander in the valley, came through with a clarity that signaled a man who had been managing an impossible situation and had just watched it become less impossible. First chalk is at the LZ, loading wounded. Second bird inbound. Corridor is holding. She swept both ridge lines, found 2 active positions on the western face, both of them reorienting toward the helicopters. She engaged the first. Moved 4 meters. Engaged the second. Both stopped. She scanned for 60 seconds. No movement. Scanned again. She lowered the rifle. She lay still for a moment, the stone warm beneath her from the afternoon sun, and she breathed. On the net, Trident Actual was running accountability. Squad by squad, company by company. The sound of it coming through her earpiece in the afternoon quiet of the ridge, each check-in a confirmation that the geometry had held. When the last squad leader checked in, Walsh exhaled into the net in the particular way of a man releasing something he has been holding at significant cost. All units, accountability complete, 480 Marines, 0 left behind. She lay still on the ridge and let the words be what they were. Then she dismounted the scope, wrapped the rifle, and began the descent. Down was harder on the knee than up had been. She moved slowly, selecting each step with care, keeping below the ridgeline, until the valley and its remaining approaches were fully screened behind her. The helicopters were still working below. She could hear them even after the ridge closed off her line of sight. The steady industrial sound of an extraction in its final phase, the sound of an operation concluding, rather than consuming. She was within 500 meters of the wire when she stopped. Not because she needed to, because some things require a moment before you can file them and move forward. The voice on the net, the words, the specific number, 480, 0 left behind. She stood in the open ground south of Edinburgh in the late afternoon light and let the moment be the length it needed to be. Then she walked through the gate. She came through it the way she had left, without announcement, without ceremony, boots on ground she had crossed 100 times. The gate guard, 22 years old and unequipped for what he was looking at, opened his mouth and could not produce a response to whatever his training had not prepared him for. She walked past him into the compound. The base had the quality of a place where news has arrived before the people it concerns. Movement stopped as she passed. A mechanic at an open engine hood, 2 supply clerks with a pallet jack, a radio operator stepping out of the communications building who stopped and held his clipboard in front of him like something he'd forgotten how to put down. She walked to the operations center and opened the door. The room held 12 people. Drummond at the primary map table, hands flat on the surface, back to the entrance. A major beside him with a handset pressed to one ear, eyes on the drone terminal. Breslin at the far wall with his arms crossed, who saw her the instant the door opened and held her gaze without expression. The duty officer saw her next. He was mid-sentence and stopped. The person he'd been addressing turned. The attention moved through the room in sequence. Drummond turned last. He looked at her face, then at the rifle, then at her right arm where the bandage had darkened through the sleeve to the surface. He looked at all three things in the space of 2 seconds with the expression of a man who is completing a calculation he began some time ago and has just arrived at the sum. Nobody spoke. Then the major with the handset said quietly to no one in particular, "Ghost 209. Not a question, a conclusion he needed to say aloud to confirm it was real. The radio net behind Drummond was still running at low volume. The extraction wrapping up squad leaders completing final accountability Trident Actual's voice steady through the speaker. 480 Marines, 0 left behind. Drummond heard it. She watched something move across his face that was not an expression in any surface sense. A deeper shift, tectonic, the kind of movement that happens when something you have been certain about for a long time rearranges itself around a piece of information it cannot absorb while remaining what it was. "Get to medical," he said. "In a moment, sir." He looked at her arm. "That is not a suggestion." "I know." He held her gaze. 3 seconds. Then to the room without looking at anyone in it. "Give us the room." The duty officer gathered his clipboard. The major set down the handset. Breslin was the last one out. He paused in the doorway and looked at Callahan, and she gave him nothing, and he walked out and pulled the door closed. Drummond pulled a chair from the nearest desk, turned it backward, and sat with his forearms on the back of it. She had never seen him sit that way before. It made him look like a different person, or perhaps like the person that existed underneath the one his rank required him to present. "You violated direct orders," he said, listing, not accusing, the voice of a man reading items he would rather not be reading. "Yes, sir." "Left your assigned post, left the wire without authorization, engaged enemy combatants without command clearance. Any single one of those is chargeable." "Yes, sir." He looked at the floor between them, then at her. "I know who signed the seal order on your file." She waited. "I signed it. October 2008, 6 weeks after your third confirmed engagement." He said it without inflection, without the architecture of self-defense, stating a fact. "Your results had attracted the attention of a special operations task force building a long-range interdiction program. They were preparing to request you. The assignment meant solo operations in unsupported terrain, extraction windows of 48 to 72 hours, no backup protocol. You would have been 24 years old." The room was quiet enough that the drone terminal's cooling fan was audible. "I decided that protecting a capability of your level meant keeping you in environments with adequate support structures. Sealing the record gave me the administrative basis to keep you in conventional assignments." He paused. "I believed I was acting in your interest." Callahan said Corporal Hewitt. Something moved across his face. Brief, real. "Corporal Hewitt was 23 years old," he said. "Best radio operator in the company. I moved her forward to cut 20 minutes off a clearance timeline. She was dead inside the hour." The words came out in the even cadence of a man who has said them to himself so many times that the saying no longer breaks anything, because everything that could be broken by them has already been. "I decided I would not make that calculation again." "You made it differently," Callahan said. The result was the same. The cooling fan, the distant sound of helicopters still working, landing and turning around and landing again. Drummond said yes, it was not a defense. It was not a concession in any tactical sense. It was a man arriving at the same destination she had already reached by a different road, finding her standing there and acknowledging that they were in the same place. She said, 480 Marines. "Yes." "I need to go to medical, sir." He stood. He reached out and took the rifle from her, not asking, holding it by the sling so she could release it and set it against the map table with the care of a man who understands what an object is and what it has just done. She walked to the door. "Callahan." She stopped, her hand on the door. "Hewitt died because the terrain was wrong and the timing was wrong, and a dozen variables converged at the worst possible moment. So did Peterson at Ramadi. That's the nature of what happens in places like this." She kept her back to him. "Your decision protected me from something real." "I'm not saying it didn't. I'm saying the ledger doesn't balance the way you calculated it." She opened the door and walked out into the late afternoon. The medical station sat on the eastern side of the compound. The corporal on duty, a young man named Ellison who had processed enough field injuries To have developed the focused efficiency of someone who had stopped being surprised by most things, cut her sleeve away without ceremony, and cleaned the wound without asking questions that were not medical. She sat still through the cleaning, which required more active management than sitting still on the ridge had. She had a theory about this developed over multiple similar experiences, but had never written it down because it did not belong in a ballistic table. 35 minutes, Ellison said, reading the wound's edges. About that. He looked at her with the professional recalibration of a man adjusting his definition of manageable. Then he finished the dressing without comment. Outside, she could hear the helicopters returning. The extraction birds coming back from the valley loaded and landing on the western pad. Through the medical station's small window, she watched them settle into the dust and the Marines spill out, some moving on their own, some not medics already in motion among them, before the rotors finished spinning down. She sat still and listened to the sound of it. The next 3 weeks moved in the way that weeks move when they contain things that have not yet resolved. The military's administrative machinery does not pause for extraordinary events. It accelerates. Forms requiring completion, reports requiring review, statements requiring collection and verification and cross-reference. Drummond filed his report the day after the extraction. Complete, the violation documented precisely. The timeline of Callahan's actions on the ridge reconstructed from the drone record and the radio traffic and the after-action statements of Bravo Company's squad leaders. And in a separate section that had no administrative template to follow, because nothing like it had come before in Drummond's experience, the full history of the SEAL order he had authorized in October 2008. He did not minimize any of it. He did not frame any portion of it to his advantage. He wrote it the way a man writes something he has decided to make permanent and accurate, because the alternative is a falsification he would have to carry. Breslin told her about the report. She read the relevant sections when they were made available to her for her own statement. She wrote her statement in the handwriting she used for her ballistic tables. Small, precise, factual. She described what she had done and why in the language of operational necessity, without decoration or appeal to any circumstance she could not document. She was also interviewed separately by the intelligence section about the notebook. That interview lasted 2 hours over 2 sessions. She provided the first 3 notebooks, the ones already full without being asked to. She described their contents, their origin, her methodology, her data sources, all of which had been open source materials available on the Operations Center's shared network during her maintenance shifts. She described the valley sketch and the date she had drawn it, and the reasoning she had applied. She described what she had noticed in the valley when she reached the Overwatch ridge, that the enemy positions matched her sketch with a precision that exceeded coincidence, that the counter-sniper position on the north face had been prepared in advance for a shooter whose approach vector had been anticipated from her notes. The intelligence officer asked her about the interpreter. She told him what she knew, which was almost nothing. She had processed the man's access credentials twice in her first week at Edinburgh and had not thought about him again. She had not been asked to assess his security posture. That was not her assignment. The intelligence officer wrote things down. He said the inquiry would continue. She said she understood. She walked out of the interview room and did not spend more time on it than the situation required. She was informed 2 weeks later that an administrative corporal had been identified as the secondary vector. Not the interpreter who had carried the photographs, but the person who had left the notebook unattended in a shared workspace when it should have been secured. A finding would be entered into the appropriate record. The inquiry was ongoing. She received this information, filed it, and moved forward. She was told to report to Camp Leatherneck for a formal board. She packed her kit, her rifle, the 3 full notebooks, and the partially completed 4th, her father's dog tag. She flew south on a logistics bird in a gray morning that smelled of rain that would not arrive. Camp Leatherneck was an installation that had accumulated administrative function the way places accumulate silt in layers over time, until the original terrain was buried under the weight of its own operational requirements. The kind of place where things got decided rather than done. The inquiry board met in a building with fluorescent light and a long table, and 5 officers who had read the reports and were now converting documentation into conclusions. She sat across from them for 2 hours over 2 days. They asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. She did not add context that was not requested. She did not explain herself. She answered in the language the situation required, which was the only language she had ever found adequate for things that actually happened. On the second day, Drummond appeared. She had not been told he would be there. She entered the room and saw him seated at the witness table to the left of the board in full uniform, with the posture she associated with him regulated exact the posture of a man who has made his decision and stopped deliberating. He testified for 40 minutes. He told them about Fallujah, about Hewitt, about the reasoning behind the seal order and the intention he had applied and the outcome his intention had produced instead of the one he intended. He did not reach for exculpation. He did not frame the account to make himself smaller than he was or larger than he was. He told it the way a person tells a thing they have been carrying to an authority that can receive it, which is a different kind of telling from the kind you do alone. When he described the seal order, one of the board members interrupted to ask whether command authority had been properly documented. Drummond provided the reference number. The member wrote it down. Drummond continued. When he finished, the senior member, a colonel whose unit she didn't recognize, looked at Drummond with an expression that was not quite readable and said, "You understand this testimony creates substantial professional exposure for you." "Yes, sir." "You're offering it voluntarily and without legal counsel present." "Yes, sir." The colonel wrote something. "Thank you, Colonel Drummond." Drummond stood, adjusted his cover, and walked out. As he passed her table, he looked at her directly, not at her name tape, not at her rank, at her face. He held it for the length of one step, and then the door opened and closed behind him, and he was gone. The inquiry's conclusions arrived 11 days later in administrative language that converted everything that had happened into categories. She had violated direct orders, documented and entered into her permanent record. No further disciplinary action given the operational outcome, the absence of civilian casualties, and the circumstances. The violation stood. The seal order was formally revoked. Her 3 prior engagements were restored to her official record, with classification modified to reflect their actual nature. The restored file was itself classified at a level that made it inaccessible without specific authorization. She was reassigned, not to Edinburgh, not to her previous unit, to a training billet at Quantico, Scout Sniper School. No promotion accompanied the reassignment. There was no ceremony, no presentation, no public statement of any kind. The operations official after-action report for Bravo Company contained one line in its supporting fire section. The line read, "Overwatch fire identity classified credited with suppressing enemy positions and enabling extraction corridor. 32 rounds expended. 480 personnel recovered. 0 killed during extraction." Her name did not appear in the document. She signed the reassignment orders in a small office with a window looking onto the main avenue of Camp Leatherneck. She signed them in her small, precise handwriting and handed them to the administrative clerk and walked out into the light. Breslin was waiting outside. He had driven from Edinburgh 2 days earlier and had been present in the particular way of men who understand that waiting is its own form of discipline, available nearby, not requiring her to account for his presence. He handed her a coffee in a paper cup. Not hot. She drank it anyway. He said, "Quantico." "Yes," he nodded once. He did not say she deserved better. He did not characterize the outcome as unjust. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman, and between them there was the understanding that institutions produce what their structures can produce, and you work within them, or you walk away, but you do not stand at the gate demanding they become something they are not yet capable of being. Bravo's squad leaders put together a statement, he said, voluntary. Wanted it in the formal record. Is it there? Drummond made sure of it. She looked across the avenue at 2 lance corporals crossing, without watching where they were going, their conversation more real to them than the physical world they were moving through. "Good," she said. Breslin looked at his cup. "You know what they call you in Bravo, what the men say about the valley." She didn't ask him to tell her. He told her anyway. Ghost 209 was watching. He said it the way you say something that has already passed from event into language, from a thing that happened into a thing that gets told. That's it, when they talk about it. Ghost 209 was watching and we made it home. She turned the paper cup in her hands. They don't know my name. Some do. Most know Ghost 209. He paused. That seemed right to you. She considered it. Not automatically, not performing consideration. Actually thinking about it, about the name and the person and the gap between them, which was a gap she had been navigating since she was 8 years old, standing on a staircase, understanding something that could not be taken back. Yes, she said, and that's right. She flew back to the continental United States 4 days later on a military transport that stopped twice before landing at a base in North Carolina. She carried her kit, her rifle, 4 notebooks, her father's dog tag. She had 2 weeks before she was required at Quantico. She spent one of them in eastern Montana. The house she had grown up in was under different ownership. She did not approach it. She drove to the edge of the property where the fence line ran along the road and parked and got out and stood in the grass and looked at the fence posts and the flat horizon beyond them and the particular quality of the morning light coming low and gold from the east, which was exactly as she had carried it, exactly as it had always been. She stood there for a while without trying to make it into anything more than what it was. She drove back to the nearest town, sat in a diner for an hour, ate a meal she didn't taste, and drank coffee that was better than anything she'd found in the previous 15 months. She opened the fourth notebook to the first used page. She wrote her father's name at the top, Patrick James Callahan, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Below it, one line, "You don't move until you know, but when you know, you don't wait." She looked at it for a moment, then she closed the notebook, left money on the table, and walked out into the Montana morning. She reported to Quantico on a Tuesday in late May. The Scout Sniper School occupied a section of the base that had its own particular quality, the quality of a place that understood the work done. There was specific in a way that demanded specificity in return. She had been through it as a student. The hides, the stalks, the range work at distances that punished imprecision and rewarded only accuracy. She had gone through it years ago and had not forgotten a day of it. She was assigned a desk in the instructor's building. She set her notebooks on the desk, put her rifle case against the wall, looked at the empty space around her the way you look at a space that will become familiar in time and is not yet. She opened the fourth notebook to a fresh page and began writing. Not ballistic data. The layout of the training lanes as she remembered them, the elevation changes, the probable wind quarters, the points in the stalk course where a student's instincts would work against them if those instincts weren't examined and rebuilt. She wrote for 40 minutes, then put the pen down and looked at what she had written. She had a week before the first class arrived. On the morning they were due, she went to the range at 0500 and shot at 500 meters until the light changed and the world became visible. She logged each round, win-hold result. The data accumulated in the notebook the way it always had, page by page, the record of a practice that did not end because the application of it was complete. She was cleaning the rifle when she heard boots on the range floor behind her. She did not look up. Sergeant Callahan, she looked up then. He was 24 years old with the focused attentiveness of someone who had passed the selection and had not yet learned that passing was the beginning of something rather than the culmination of it. He held a notebook in his hand. Standard issue black crisp at the corners, the first page is still blank. She looked at the notebook. At the way he held it, the weight of it not yet familiar, not yet broken in by use, not yet containing anything that would matter to anyone. She had held her first notebook exactly that way. She remembered the weight of it, the blankness. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He opened the notebook to the first blank page. He looked at her and waited. She pulled the fourth notebook from beside her and opened it to the page with her father's name at the top. She looked at the line beneath it for a moment. Then she looked at the young sergeant with his clean notebook and his uncalloused attention. She began. Drummond retired in March of 2012. The ceremony was at Camp Pendleton. His service record was 31 years long. He did not give a speech. Breslin made Sergeant Major in 2014 and retired in 2015. He sent her a letter when the promotion came through. She wrote back. They exchanged letters for several years, and then the interval between letters lengthened in the way that intervals do until the interval itself becomes the condition. The file marked Ghost 209 remained classified until a partial review in 2019 opened 2 of the 3 engagement records to a limited research clearance. The third remained sealed. A researcher working on a historical documentation project in late 2019 found the Bravo Company after-action report from April 2010. He read through it with the patience of someone who had learned that the most significant material was rarely flagged as such. He reached the supporting fire section and read the single line. Overwatch fire identity classified 32 rounds, 480 personnel recovered, 0 killed during extraction. He read it twice. He reached for his pen and wrote a note in the margin of his working copy. Not part of any official record, not something that would appear in any document. Just a question a researcher asks himself when he encounters a thing he does not yet understand. The note said only, "Who was this?" He spent 4 months trying to find the answer. He did not find it. The identity remained classified. The line in the report remained what it was, 1 sentence, no name, no rank, no photograph. The irreducible minimum of a record that someone had decided should exist, but not too visibly. Exactly as she had wanted. In the Scout Sniper School's instructor rotation records, her name appeared for 4 consecutive years, before she was reassigned again to a position whose nature and location were also in the administrative language of a file sealed by a different authority on a different date for different reasons classified. The notebooks she left behind, not the operational ones which went with her, but two that she had filled during her years at Quantico with material intended for instruction, remained in the school's reference library in a section reserved for instructor-developed doctrine. They were not labeled with her name. They were labeled by subject and date. Her handwriting was in them, her methodology. The accumulated reasoning of someone who had learned to read terrain as a young girl on a fence line in Montana and had never stopped refining the vocabulary for what she saw. Students who used them over the years did not know whose they were. They used them because the data was precise and the reasoning was clear, and the annotations in the margins addressed exactly the questions that arose in practice. The notebooks were checked out and returned, checked out and returned. The pages wore with handling. The entries did not change. She had written them to be used.